This is Mr. Little, and you're listening to Resistance on the High Seas. As a child, I was always fascinated by pirates. I learned the names of a lot of famous pirates, like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd. I watched pirate movies as much as I was allowed to, and I played with little pirate toys, men with swords and muskets and treasure chests going on adventures on the high seas. What was so cool about pirates? I think one of the things that made them cool was that they didn't seem to belong to a country. They didn't have a flag that was identifiable with a state. They did have a flag. They had the skull and crossbone. And, like a state, they did combat. They had ships and guns and technology and weapons. And they would do battle with the state. And sometimes they would win. Like, sometimes the bad guys win. That was kind of a mind-blowing concept for a child. I would later learn that the more technical term for what the pirates did when they, say, challenged the British Royal Navy was actually to challenge Great Britain's legitimacy in the use of physical force. The legitimate use of physical force, it's an idea that goes back to several philosophers from the pre-Enlightenment times, including Thomas Hobbes. But basically, it's the foundation of thinking that violent acts are criminal acts because only the state, the government, is allowed to use violence to serve an end, hence the justification for military and police forces. Historically, this has been a topic of some debate, and it still is, even today. Piracy, and acts by pirates, represent a challenge to the concept of a government monopoly on violence. Thinking about piracy and what makes it so leads to a bunch of related questions such as, what is the source of violence? Who has the right to use or direct others to use violence? And is it a good idea that a state should have a monopoly on violence? So most pirate-related media and stories in the United States center on what is referred to as the Golden Age of piracy, a period that extended from the late 1600s to the mid-1700s and was mostly focused on the Caribbean. The geographic context of this Golden Age of piracy is critical. Recall that the Caribbean was a hodgepodge of European colonies that were scattered and sometimes poorly defended, yet were also incredibly profitable through the trading of some of the most valuable crops in the world at the time, such as sugar and tobacco. The European states involved, such as Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, were often at war with one another, and those wars sometimes spilled over into their colonies. To understand pirates in the Golden Age of piracy, we have to look at the first group of pirates, and these were people referred to as privateers. And in the Caribbean, they were known as buccaneers, from the French word boucanés, a name for those who hunted wild pigs. These sailors were used by the less powerful European states, such as the Netherlands or Great Britain, to compete on the high seas with the more powerful European naval powers, such as Spain or Portugal, via a license known as a letter of marque. While seemingly clear-cut, the marque concept should give one pause, as this approved violence was done outside of the practical power of the state to regulate the activity. Therefore, one almost imagines lighting a fuse on a stick of dynamite and then walking away. The potential dangers of privateers was illustrated by one of the earliest privateers turned pirates, a man named Henry Avery. Gifted with impressive height, he was also gifted in the art of persuasion, which may explain how he convinced his crew to follow him into piracy. Before becoming a pirate, Avery served in the British Royal Navy in the late 1600s during one of Britain's many wars against France and Spain. In 1694, Avery and the crew of an English commissioned privateering ship, commissioned to attack French ships in the Caribbean, revolted against their captain over lost wages and ill treatment. They promptly sailed to the Indian Ocean, where they intended to commit piracy and get rich quickly. They sailed to the opening of the Red Sea, where they met 5 additional privateering ships with the same idea. All of these ships had privateering licenses, letters of marque, from the King of England, but for the Americas, not for the Indian Ocean. Why the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean? Well, what all these sailors were waiting for was the annual Mughal Empire pilgrimage fleet making its way to Mecca for the Hajj. In early September 1695, Avery's fleet encountered the Mughal pilgrimage fleet, a vast fleet of 27 ships, and decided to launch a daring attack. Despite being outnumbered 5-1 in both men and ships, the attackers' bold action let them capture the Ganges Savaii, the largest ship in the pilgrimage fleet. This was in part because the confidence of the attackers unnerved the crew of the Ganges Savaii, and by accident 2 of their cannons exploded, causing chaos on the ship. After the capture and looting of the ship, Avery and the others made off with perhaps £500,000 sterling, at a time when the average sailor earned about £65 a year. Interestingly, one of the passengers on the Ganges Safai was a close relative of then-reigning Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. This prompted a massive diplomatic incident in which the emperor threatened to expel the English East India Company from their trading forts in India unless he was compensated for the loss of this ship, thinking that Avery, being English, was somehow connected to the East India Company. And the English East India Company eventually compensated the emperor. As amazing and as sort of dashing as this story sounds, there are a few things to be kept in mind. Number one is that Avery and his fleet basically committed the equivalent of war crimes. Members of the attacking fleet, who were later captured, testified to murdering some of their captives, torturing others, and to the mass rape of the female passengers on the ship, so much so that many women committed suicide by jumping over the ship and into the sea. The second thing to keep in mind is that Avery and his men had clearly acted outside of the word of their contract with the King of England. They, and those they inspired, exceeded that license and perpetuated general violence on the high seas against all. And this exceeding of the license demonstrates that pirates, in addition to their lust for gold and treasure, were also a sort of resistance, if you will, opposing the state's monopoly on the use of force. The English East India Company, which also operated under a license from Great Britain, promptly put a bounty on Avery's head. However, this was to no avail. Avery himself vanished into history within 2 years, one of the few pirates not to end hanging from a rope. Avery's share of the treasure seized from the pilgrimage fleet has never been recovered, and it is unknown if he hid it or lost it all. Although Avery may have thought of himself as a full-blown pirate, he never said so. In 1696, 1 year after the raid on the pilgrimage fleet, Avery brought his ship to Nassau, the capital of the British-run Bahamas. There, he bribed the governor to allow him to trade his captured loot and return to his native Scotland. This act of bribery would inaugurate the strong presence of pirates in the Bahamas for the next 20 years. After Avery, a growing community of pirates continued to operate out of the Bahamas. Among them was a one Benjamin Hornigold. Much like Avery, Hornigold got his start in the Royal Navy, fighting in the War of Spanish Succession, which raged from 1700 to 1714, and was one of the largest wars in European history at that point. After the war, the British Royal Navy downsized, and Hornigold moved to Nassau, perhaps inspired by Avery. There he began small-scale raiding against Spanish ships and Spanish-held Florida, all without a letter of marque. Eventually, Hornigold captured a warship known as the Marianne, sometime in 1716, and used it to start attacking ships in the region without fear. Because of his bold ability and powerful ship, Hornigold was seen as the de facto leader of the pirates of Nassau. Nassau and the Bahamas had been without effective government since 1703, when a combined Spanish-French raid had driven away most of the population. Technically speaking, a British governor remained after those raids, but Hornigold was the real power, daring to describe the governor as, quote, a troublesome old fart. He declared all the people in Nassau under his protection and organized the construction of a major fortress to protect the islands from attack, using the cannons from various captured ships to do so. This society of traders, raiders, small farmers, and free blacks is described by the historian Colin Woodard as the Republic of Pirates. To be clear, this was not a democracy, or a republic as we would traditionally think of it. Hornigold would be the only quote-unquote leader of this republic because he was the fiercest of the pirates. However, there were some representative tendencies among the pirate crews, unlike the structure of royal navies at the time, which explains why almost everyone willingly joined a pirate crew. According to Woodard, quote, they, the sailors, had no intention of replicating the old system, but rather turning it on its head. They took to electing their captains, and if dissatisfied with their selections, they could remove them. Pirates gave their captains absolute authority while in combat, but most other decisions were made democratically in a general council of the crew, including where to go, what to attack, which prisoners to retain or set free, and how to punish transgressions within their companies. Pirate captains ate the same food as their men and had to share their sleeping quarters. In terms of loot, pirate captains only received 2 shares compared to a crewman's 1. This was a far cry from the sometimes 50 shares a captain of a Royal Navy ship might take. To be clear, having some representative features does not mean pirates were non-violent. On the contrary, pirates could and did commit horrendous acts of violence. However, this violence did not come out of thin air. It originated in the conflict between European states, who sought to use pirates to their own end, under the label of privateers. But as often as not, pirates disregarded their limits and built their own societies with their own rules. Some of those rules, which were more democratic and equitable than royal societies at the time. In light of this knowledge, it begs the question whether we should view pirates as mad, money-lusting bandits out for blood, or consider them as radical rebels out to build their own society, albeit very violently. However, only 12 short years later, the Pirate Republic was brought down via the reassertion of British authority and by the actions of Hornigold himself. Hornigold apparently had conflicting thoughts on his role as a pirate, refusing to attack British ships. So staunch was his refusal to attack British ships that Hornigold's crew actually voted to replace him with another captain in late 1717. Hornigold saw himself as a patriot, settling the scores of the old war against Spain. Or maybe he just wanted to keep one major power in the Caribbean happy. Either way, in 1718, the British Crown offered to pardon all pirates who ceased activities. This was more of a bluff. The British had still not re-established a Caribbean fleet which had been lost in a storm. However, Hornigold took the opportunity and convinced many of his followers to do the same. But not everybody took the offer. Hornigold's protege, Edward Teach, more famously known as Blackbeard the Pirate, continued his acts of piracy and was hunted down and killed 2 years later off the coast of South Carolina. Another pirate, Bartholomew Roberts, aka Black Bart, would terrorize the Caribbean until 1722, most infamously capturing and summarily hanging a French governor from his mast. His activities were so prolific, capturing over 400 ships, that trade between the Caribbean and Europe virtually ceased for several years at the height of his activities. However, the Republic of Pirates in the Caribbean pales in comparison to the largest pirate fleet in history, which formed about 100 years later in East Asia. Unlike piracy in the Caribbean, piracy in East Asia was never sanctioned by the state. In fact, various Chinese governments under the Ming and the Cheng dynasties tried to restrict maritime activity and trade, at one point even attempting to relocate all coastal communities 10 miles inland. This opposition to maritime trade and maritime activity from the government meant that every act, from something as mundane as smuggling to assisting Vietnamese rebels against the Ming dynasty, was a sort of resistance against the state. Geographically speaking, the southern coast of China and the South China Sea had so many little inlets and places you could hide a ship that it was the perfect place for piracy. For that reason, pirates represented a viable alternative to established governments, almost a state within the state, at least in the coastal regions of southern China, Guangzhou, or sometimes referred to as Canton. Like the state, pirates did offer services to the coastal communities that agreed to work with them. This included protection from government soldiers and payments to families of pirates who were killed in battle. Of course, this was also combined with a sort of protection racket, the classic pay us or you're going to have a bad accident pitch. And the pirates carried through with their threats. There are numerous accounts of pirates in East Asia laying waste to entire villages who refused to participate. Among the various pirates who ruled over the South China Sea was the one Cheng, known in English either as Madam Cheng or the Dragon Lady. Though her origins are somewhat obscure, some say she was a prostitute and others say she was simply a poor peasant girl, she nonetheless caught the attention of the pirate lord Zheng Yi. Yi commanded a fleet of over 300 ships and was from a family who had practiced piracy for generations. Yi married Shi, but Shi was more than a wife. She helped Yi lead the pirate fleet and commanded ships in battle. Yi and Shi's fleet was known as the Red Fleet, one of several pirate fleets, but the largest among them. Yi would eventually die in a storm in 1807, but it was Shi's experience that would give her the authority to succeed him as leader of the Red Fleet. And Shi continued to grow that fleet to possibly 1,000 ships, if eyewitness accounts are to be believed, which would have made it the largest pirate fleet in history. Of all the stories we have about Shi and the Red Fleet, perhaps the most interesting are those accounts of how the Red Fleet divided their loot and plunder. According to stories, all the loot and plunder from a raid was accounted for and held in a storage house of sorts, where it would then be distributed as needed. For example, to ships who had no luck raiding that week. If this sounds like a form of taxation, it basically is. Additionally, the Red Fleet under Shi had strict policies for governing their conduct, written and agreed upon by all the pirate captains. This might reflect in part the long pattern of established state bureaucracy and written rules in China. Perhaps some of that structure carried over into pirate practices, even as they opposed the government. The account of Richard Glasspoole, an English East India Company employee who was taken prisoner by the pirates in 1809, provides an insight into the organization of the Red Fleet. Glasspoole provides describes several features of the pirate code, which included a strict hierarchy and central command under Shi, defiance of which meant instant execution, even mid-combat, and it was said that she herself carried that out at least once. It also included a strict ban on plundering any villages allied to the pirate fleet, as well as a strict rule against taking advantage of female captives. It was said that she often wore dragons on her outfits, and hence why she is sometimes referred to as the Dragon Lady. Now, dragons are cool just by themselves, but recall that dragons have long been a symbol of Chinese imperial power. For example, in the Cheng dynasty, the emperors were painted, often featuring dragons on their clothing. She challenged the authority of the Chinese government by just wearing what she wore, putting herself symbolically on the same level as the emperor. What finally became of the Red Fleet? Well, much like piracy in the Caribbean, the Cheng government was unable to defeat the pirates and attempted to offer them amnesty. Initially, very few took the offer. In 1809, ships in the Red Fleet massacred a ship of Portuguese monks, and this made the Portuguese government in the colony of Macau in southern China near the mouth of the Tiger River take notice. In 3 naval engagements, despite having massive numerical superiority, she and her fleet were defeated by the Portuguese navy in the area, which convinced them to take the Chinese government's amnesty offer. She actually lived out the rest of her life, running several business establishments in Guangzhou, specifically, it is believed, a gambling den. So, piracy came to an end in both the Caribbean and East Asia at the dawn of the modern era. It was the assertion of state power that made piracy untenable. Specifically, naval dominance and a willingness to use it. The depiction of pirates as bloodthirsty killers disrupting the world order is indeed true. Keep in mind Avery's fleet and their behavior with the Ganges Savai, and pirate activity disrupting world trade. From this perspective, the suppression of piracy is a necessity for a peaceful world. Looking back at the 19th and 20th centuries, though, it would seem that the states of Europe and China conducted far more violence than any pirate fleet ever did. Pirates can only exist where states or other forces cannot be effective, be that in the Caribbean or the South China Sea, or in our modern world in places such as Somalia. Somalia saw a massive rise in piracy beginning in the year 2000, until international navies interfered to suppress piracy. Perhaps it is a strange coincidence that Somalia is the same general area where Avery and his fleet kicked off the golden age of piracy. On another level, piracy can exist in the murky corners of cyberspace or on the dark web. It is because of this lack of centralized control that pirates have agency to create their own societies and ways of doing things, however simple that might be. The history of pirates shows that sometimes their societies were more representative, just, and equitable than the societies of Europe or the established dynasties of China. They represented an alternative. Pirates were incredibly violent towards those they opposed. I have said that several times, and I want to underscore that point. But recall that at least in the Caribbean, this violence began with the approval of the European monarchs. Should we let the narrative about the lust for gold and destruction overshadow the real questions pirates force us to consider about the power to commit violence, the origins of organized violence, and the efforts of pirates to create their own society? Legitimacy in the use of physical force was not a wholly formed philosophical idea during the golden age of piracy, as it was relatively new. But looking back on piracy, while we live in a world where the idea of the state and government and their legitimate use of force is omnipresent, provides a new lens through which to examine the acts of pirates and the golden age of piracy. I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something, but I hope you also walk away with a few questions. This is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.